Imagine raising a daughter, loving her more than life itself, only to find out she got married behind your back. No invitation, no warning, just a cold phone call saying, "We only invited people who really matter." And then, as if that betrayal wasn't enough, she demands the keys to your family's beach house so she and her new husband can spend their honeymoon there. But what she didn't know was that her perfect groom carried a past darker than anyone could imagine, Liz. Manipulation and secrets buried for years. And the gift I left at their doorstep didn't come wrapped in shiny paper. It came wrapped in truth. Truth so devastating that it made the groom scream in rage, while my daughter's world began to collapse around her. This isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about justice. Stay with me, and subscribe to Silent Lies for the full story. He arrived in an immaculate navy suit that did not look like it had ever met a wrinkle or a rush. He held roses as if they were props and spoke in a voice tuned to please a room. The air outside smelled like rain, the kind that changes its mind and moves back out to sea, and Madison's cheeks were flushed with that particular glow of a new certainty. "Mom, he is different," she said, practically floating through my doorway. "He really understands me." I wanted to understand him too. I wanted very much to approve, to lift my daughter into a life where someone would guard the light in her instead of dimming it. I made my lasagna, the one she had begged for every birthday since 12, the one I could assemble blindfolded, each layer a small ceremony of mother love. He complimented everything he could see: the framed beach photographs, the hand-carved bowl my sister gave me, the view out the kitchen window that caught the last amber tails of sunset. He complimented my career as a nurse and asked questions that sounded practiced, as if he had rehearsed curiosity in front of a mirror. He noticed the small seashell on the windowsill and turned it in his fingers like a coin. "Beautiful place to grow up," he said. "Is this near that beach house you have on the Cape?" "Madison told me about your summers." He said the words beach house with an appreciative smile that flashed and vanished before it could be measured. He insisted on helping with the dishes. He rolled up his sleeves and revealed precisely tanned forearms, a casual revelation that did not feel casual. Perfect gentleman behavior should have been charming, and yet it skimmed across my skin like silk that was hiding a snag. I had known that performance before. My ex-husband wore it the way some men wear their watches, as a sign, as a signal, as a way to make time bend around their wishes. I reminded myself that people can be good and polished at the same time. I reminded myself that a mother's fears can become a hammer that mistakes everything for a nail. When he hugged me goodbye, he added the final stroke to the portrait he wanted me to keep. "Your mother raised an extraordinary woman," he told Madison while looking at me. "You must be so proud." I was. She had built a life on her own terms, earned her promotions, bought her condo, and learned to laugh without asking permission. Pride can be blinding. It can tell you that a nagging feeling is just indigestion. The days slid into weeks where Trevor was suddenly everywhere in my daughter's stories. He had advice about her colleagues. He had suggestions about what a truly ambitious marketing professional would do next. He had opinions about her oldest friend from college, the one who, in his view, did not respect the hours of a committed relationship. I listened on our phone calls, the daily ones that had always anchored my afternoons. They shrank. I would wait with a cup of tea cooling in my hand, and when she called the next day, there would be a bright reason. Work, traffic, a last-minute date night. Nothing to worry about, Mom. There are 1,000 ways to move a person from the center of your life to the margins without leaving footprints. A change in pronouns is one of them. We think. We are trying. We have decided. The we grew like ivy over the walls where she and I used to hang our small, ordinary talks. It is ordinary to lose some closeness to the tide of love. It is not ordinary to wake and find the door barred from the other side. I saw their engagement on my phone like any stranger would. A photograph of my daughter's hand with a diamond that caught the light too zealously, captioned with a neat little forever. The number of likes climbed like a thermometer in July. I stared long enough that my coffee surrendered its warmth. I called immediately and told myself to leave my hurt in the other room with the folded laundry. She answered with excitement tumbling over itself. "It just happened," she said. There were parents called and plans whispered and a country club where arrangements bloom like hydrangeas. When she paused, I asked the kind of question mothers ask when they are trying to keep a door open with their foot. "When is the engagement party, sweetheart?" There was a silence that did not belong in a call like this. "Next Saturday," she said, very small. And then another silence, larger, like a wave gathering. "It is very traditional," she went on. "Trevor's family has a way of doing things. It is mostly his side. their customs, their expectations. She spoke as if she was apologizing for the weather. I heard in her careful tone the trick of making me complicit in my own exclusion. If I did not protest, I was understanding. If I did, I was a boundary problem. I swallowed the old ache that has lived in me since Robert walked out when she was 8 and left a map of absence that took years to redraw. I told her I loved her and I was happy for her, and we would celebrate, the three of us, another time. Another time never came. Instead, notices arrived as if by courier. The venue had been found. The photographer was brilliant. The flowers would be soft and modern. When I asked about a date so I could arrange my shifts at the library, she said early October probably, second weekend maybe. The beach house, I ventured, could be lovely. She laughed the way people do when they are repeating somebody else's opinion and do not know it yet. Trevor wants something elegant, Mom. Not a backyard, not sand. It was such a small sting and it hurt so much. She had told me at 9 she would say her vows barefoot between the dunes under strings of lights we hung with our own hands. But life revises. I learned to nod at revisions even when they erase your handwriting. I learned to keep listening. The call about boundaries came on a Tuesday that smelled like clean linen and lemon oil. I had towels in my arms when she asked me to be cool about something. He thinks couples thrive when they are independent, she said. He showed me articles. He says I call you when I am stressed instead of leaning on him. Words like healthy and space and patterns fell into place with the precision of a lock. I heard the old game dressed as modern therapy. What worried me most was not the theory but the application. Holidays with his family. New traditions that did not include me. Questions about the house near the ocean not as a place for memories but as a piece on a board. As a pressure, as a problem to be solved. I kept my voice serene because mothers lose more when their voices shake. I told her I would think about it. Then I did what you do when the ground tilts under your kitchen chair. I made a list. Names, dates, my late husband's papers. The name Morrison flickered like a match in the back of a drawer. I called my sister and said he is very interested in our traditions, and she said that means he wants to belong. I wanted so desperately to believe in belonging. Still, a pattern is a patient thing. It repeats. The fewer calls. The small erasures. The way he looked at my daughter as if she were an acquisition he had won at auction. The way he looked at the beach house as if it were a portfolio line. When the ring photo slipped into the world, I did not post a comment. I called. She gushed about the restaurant and the surprise and the parents on his side and the plans that were gently, politely closed to me. She sounded happy in the way someone sounds inside a very pretty cage. I told her October would be beautiful. I asked out loud for a date. She gave me a month and a maybe. I asked nothing about dresses because the pictures would tell me later, which they did. With his mother leaned in close and glowing. I began to walk in the late afternoons to keep the fear from setting up a bed in my chest. I walked past couples arguing about dinners and teenagers throwing a basketball that never seemed to go in the net, and dogs who loved everybody without hesitation. I walked until my thoughts tired enough to let me sleep. I woke and reminded myself that my child is an adult who chooses. Love is the art of letting the person you love choose. Survival is the art of seeing when those choices are being written for them. The phone call that finally cut the ribbon on the truth came cold and fast. We already got married, Mom. We kept it small. We only invited people who matter. The words were delivered like a bill. After the quiet that followed, she asked for the keys to the beach house for their honeymoon, as if the door to my life could be opened by request in a sentence. I asked if she was legally married or ceremonially married, because precise questions help. Both, she said, and asked me not to be dramatic. I told her I would send the keys. Then I set the phone down and looked at my garden, at the roses that bloom without asking permission, and I began to plan. I did not rage. I did not plead. I took a notebook from the drawer where I keep batteries, string, and the warranties I never need until I do, and I began with a line across the top. What I know. Under it I wrote dates, names, and the things that had bothered me in small ways that did not feel small anymore. I wrote down the first dinner when he praised the beach house without ever having seen it. I wrote down the sudden scarcity of my daughter's voice after years of ordinary closeness. I wrote down the way tradition had become a word that meant exclusion, and the way healthy boundaries had been used like a curtain to hide a locked door. When I had finished the list, I made tea I did not drink. And I opened a box of Robert's old files that I had not touched since his funeral. Grief is a long coastline, and some days the tide is quiet. But the name Morrison rolled through my memory like a wave that knows exactly where it is going. I found a manila folder stamped with the year 1987. I remembered the fights, the papers, the phone calls that did not end, the investors who sat in our living room trying to be calm while my daughter built cities out of blocks at their feet. I remembered how my husband had believed a partner who smiled the way Trevor smiles. Inside the folder were notes about a shopping center project that never opened and deposits that went one direction only. I copied names. I wrote down a bank I had never heard of and a law firm in Miami. I went to the library on my day off and sat at a computer that does not know how to forget. Obituaries, court filings, clipping archives with photographs that faded to a sepia ghost. William Morrison, the grandfather, had died in Florida in 1993, and the obituary mentioned a grandson named Trevor. There was a footnote in the newspaper about a late-in-life illness and a whispered confession. Money, offshore accounts, a trail that had cooled for everyone except the heir, who had a map. I made calls that were not usual for me. I telephoned an old friend of Madison's from college who works in a place that wears secrecy politely. I asked questions that mothers do not like to ask. Has he ever worked where people who pay you can be called, and asked if you were there at 9 on a Tuesday? Has he ever sent an invoice that had a real address on it? Has he ever been seen returning from work looking like a person who had done something measurable? The friend hesitated, and then not very long. He is always available, she said, always between projects, always generous with advice he did not seem to value enough to sell. I wrote to a private investigator whose name came from a widow in my grief group, a woman who had discovered too late that her husband had left behind debts and secrets nested like dolls inside other secrets. The investigator was calm and methodical. He told me exactly what he would do and what it would cost, and then he reminded me to breathe. Breathing feels optional when your child may be in a story that will hurt her forever, but I did as I was told. A week passed in a long, thin thread. I gardened. I counted the days out loud to keep the thoughts from multiplying. The report arrived as a password-protected file that felt heavier than paper on my screen. There were names I had never wanted to know and names I already knew. Emma Chen, a family with a successful restaurant chain, a broken engagement when a father found gambling debts that were not theoretical. Sarah Walsh, a trust that had been protected by brothers who still believed in their job. There were photographs too pristine to be chance Madison on a sidewalk weeks before the coffee spill that had felt like fate. There were shell companies with names that tried too hard to sound serious and accounts that lived in places with beaches and secrecy. There were emails to a man named Marcus who specialized in making money sound like it belonged where it did not. I sat very still and listened to the refrigerators hum the way nurses do when a monitor flattens for a second and then finds a heartbeat again. The rage I had not allowed at the beginning came, but it did not spill. It held steady like a hand on a sternum, ready to compress at the right depth and count. I called the law firm that had managed the last of Robert's estate, the one that had told me gently that the shopping center loss would never be unwound. They remembered. They had never truly stopped watching the old lines, even when the ink had dried. When I explained what I had found, a partner called me back the same day. She was precise and patient, and told me that my daughter, as Robert's heir, had claims that had slept for years but could be woken. She said words like restitution and constructive trust and interest, and she asked for permission to reach out to a contact in federal law enforcement who watched the waterways where these kinds of ships travel. That night I wrapped a box. I chose silver paper because wedding gifts are a ritual and rituals can carry many kinds of meaning at once. I slid inside a leather portfolio that had belonged to my father, a thing made to carry papers across time with dignity. In the first sleeve I placed photocopies of the 1987 partnership agreement and the bank statements that bled. In the second sleeve I placed newspaper clippings that told the story in cold, unemotional fonts, the confession, the death, the grandson who had been named in a probate matter that no one took seriously because the money had seemed to vanish. In the third sleeve I placed the private investigator's timeline, cleaned of anything that would put his methods at risk but heavy with what mattered. In the fourth sleeve I put a letter from the estate attorney with her card and 2 sentences that made it clear she was ready to speak. And then, because grace matters even in war, I slipped in the keys to the beach house, on the same keyring Madison used when she was 16 and wanted to drive to the ocean at dawn. I wrote a note that did not tremble. Congratulations on your marriage. Every new husband should know his wife's family history. With love, Carol. Love is sometimes a scalpel. I placed the package on their porch in the soft gray hour when the city has not decided which day it will be. I took a photograph only so I could prove to myself later that I had truly done it, because sometimes the right thing feels like a dream you are not sure you had. I went home and put the kettle on. Steam curled and disappeared. The roses outside needed deadheading, and I carried the shears with me so my hands would have work while my mind waited. At 2:17 in the afternoon, the phone rang, and my daughter's name lit up across the screen like a lighthouse. I answered. I heard his voice first, too loud, stripped of charm, the voice of a man who has been told the mirror has a crack he cannot polish away. "What is wrong with you?" he shouted. "You are insane. You are harassing us." I set my teacup down and let the porcelain meet the saucer with a sound that felt like punctuation. "Hello, Trevor," I said. "I take it you opened your gift." He threatened police and lawsuits, as if the law were a dog he could whistle for who would come sit at his heel. I asked him which part offended him most, the public records or the obituary or the bank memos that did not care about his performance. In the background, I heard my daughter crying, asking to speak to me, and then his voice again, thick with fear disguised as authority. I told him a quiet truth that I knew would find the exact place to land. The attorney who handled Robert's estate would be reaching out about the accounts his grandfather mentioned before he died. The funds belonged to Madison now. There had been a calculation, I said, and he was going to discover he had rounded the wrong way. His voice changed. Panic is unmistakable on a line. It comes in thin and breathy, like a man walking along the edge of a roof he thought was wider. "You are lying," he said, but the words held less weight than the silence between them. I told him I am a nurse. We learn not to lie to ourselves about vital signs. Then I told him there was a lawyer in Miami who would remember his name and a man named Marcus who had not been very careful with his emails. I told him the keys were in the portfolio. He could take my daughter to the ocean and try to talk about forever, but the tide would be coming in with facts. I hung up. For a long moment I stood in the quiet of my kitchen and listened to the house breathe. The floor creaked, the refrigerator clicked. A distant gull announced itself as if we already stood at the shore. There are days when a life turns and you can feel the axis under your feet. This was such a day. I did not know what would happen next. I only knew that a story which had been written for my daughter without her consent had reached the paragraph where the pen changes hands. Madison did not call that night. She did not call the next morning either. Silence can be a verdict or a bridge, and I could not tell which one it would be. On Sunday, when the sky was the color of a bruise about to fade, I opened my front door and found her on the steps like a girl who had fallen asleep waiting for a ride home from a dance that ended badly. She wore the same blouse and jeans from Friday, and her eyes were swollen, her hair unbrushed, her fingers restless around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold. "Tell me everything," she said. She did not say hello. Her voice was the small voice she used when she was 6 and had torn the knee of her good tights on the playground and did not know if I would be angry or kind. I made fresh coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table where she had once practiced multiplication, where she had once signed her first apartment lease with a pen that skipped and made her laugh at her own nervous hand. She did not look at me while she told the story. "Trevor left yesterday. He took 2 suitcases. He said he needed time to think. He said you were poisoning our marriage and that if I believed you, then maybe we were never meant to be." She laid a manila folder on the table like a witness taking the stand. I found this after he walked out. His desk, his bag, his laptop. Emails printed and stapled, hard black letters that did not know how to be kind. Marcus Webb. Inheritance. Offshore. Access. The dates reached back long before the day the coffee spilled on his shirt in the story she had always called fate. I read, "She watched my face the way people watch the sky when the forecast promised thunder, but the first claps have not yet arrived." There were instructions about how to move money in increments that would not draw questions, language about legitimacy and community property, calculations that treated marriage like a tool and not a vow. "He researched us," she said, and the word us trembled. "He knew about the beach house and about Dad, and about how alone I felt after he left. He knew that I call you when I am scared. He knew the way. A locksmith knows a door that has been damaged and can be opened with a gentle pressure in the right spot." I told her about Emma and about Sarah, and she stared at the wooden grain of the table as if answers might rise out of the varnish. She texted Emma from my phone because her own felt contaminated by the day before, and when Emma's voice came through the speaker, it was steady in the way voices become when they have already survived the worst part. Emma described the charming attention that turned into control, the financial advice that turned into signatures, the sudden insistence on independence from family dressed up as mature love. She connected us to Sarah, and the pattern completed itself like a lock clicking open when the last number lands true. My daughter listened with her knuckles pressed to her mouth, She did not cry. Her eyes grew clear instead. The way eyes grow clear when anger is not the kind that burns a room down, but the kind that builds the scaffolding for justice. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Because questions are sometimes the only tools a mother can hand to a grown child. She lifted her head and I saw the fierce little girl who once stood in front of a friend and told a bully to find a different playground. "I am going to destroy him," she said, and her voice did not shake. "But I will need your help." For the first time in too long, she needed me. For the first time since the smile in the expensive suit had walked into my kitchen, I felt my spine unlock and my breath come all the way down into my lungs. On Monday, she met with the attorney from Robert's estate while I waited in the lobby with a book I did not read. The attorney, Patricia Winters, spoke in a language I understood from hospital corridors, precise, careful, with no room for wishful thinking. The statute on the old theft had run, she said, but Trevor's recent access had not. Receiving stolen property is not a ghost that disappears because paper's yellow. Money laundering does not become honest because a groom wears a boutonniere. "There is another conversation we should have," Patricia said, and she brought in a woman who carried herself like a person whose job is to follow invisible roads. Special Agent Jennifer Liu introduced herself with a handshake that told me she had walked into many rooms where truth was hiding under a rug. Agent Liu had a folder too, and inside it were pieces of a puzzle I had not known existed outside of our house. Complaints from Emma's family and from Sarah's, sightings, banking patterns that looked like tides, gentle in and out until a storm swells them. "We have been watching," she said. "We could not move without someone on the inside who is willing to stand still while the storm arrives. If you are willing, Madison, we can set conditions that allow him to tell the truth in a place where the truth can be kept." She did not say the word wire until my daughter asked for it. Then she explained softly that it would be legal, it would be documented, and it would be safe. There would be agents' clothes. There would be a plan for the moment when words turned into handcuffs. Madison looked at me. I am not the one who gets to say yes or no to her risks, but I am the one who raised her to count to 10 when she is angry, and to remember that justice is only justice when it leaves room for mercy for yourself. I told her I trusted her to know her own courage. She turned back to the agent and said yes. 2 days passed, like a held breath. On Wednesday afternoon, a message blinked on her phone in the tone he used when he wanted to sound like a man who makes amends. "Can we talk? I miss you. I am ready to come home." I watched her type the words that tasted like ash in her mouth. "I miss you too. I am sorry I doubted you. My mother was jealous. I want us." She pressed send, and then she set the phone on the table as if it were a small animal that might bite. Within minutes he replied, "Friday. Flowers. Wine. We will start fresh." Agent Liu reviewed the messages and nodded. "He is walking into his own outline," she said. Thursday morning, they wired the apartment. The agents placed small devices in everyday objects that would bear routine movement without suspicion. A harmless picture frame, a lamp cord, a coaster on the coffee table. Madison practiced asking questions that sounded like devotion but held doorways open for a confession to walk through. She would not say trap. She would not say bait. She said truth over and over, like a prayer for a life she wanted back. On Friday, I pretended to read on my couch while the sun moved across the floor in slow bars, and my phone sat face up beside my teacup. At 7:43 in the evening, she texted, "He is here." At 8:15, another message. "Flowers and wine, apologies, a perfect scene." At 8:52, a line that made my heart trip. "He is talking about a real honeymoon, asks about my savings for the deposit, asks whether the house is really in your name, asks about transferring title someday so he can renovate." The next message came at 9:31 and held only 6 words. He admitted he knew. They are moving. After that, there were no more texts, because there did not need to be. The plan was a machine, and machines do not stop to narrate their own workings. I stood up and sat down, because movement is a language of its own, and then I poured a glass of wine that I did not drink. I did not turn on the television. I listened to my clock, and to the faraway sound of a motorcycle on the road above the dunes that nobody rides at night unless they are restless or free. I did not know which one I would be when the phone finally rang. It rang at 10:04. "Mom," Madison said, and her voice had a note in it that I had not heard in 2 years. "Relief is heavy and light at once. They have him," he said the words. "He told me he married me because he could make what my father lost into something he owned through marriage. He told me he knew about the accounts. He told me he deserved to benefit because his grandfather did the work of hiding it. There was a pause, and when she spoke again there was an iron rod inside her gentleness. They put him in a car and drove away. The apartment is very quiet now. Come home, I said. She did. And we sat at the table with the lamp on low the way we used to when she was 14, and would come back from some first disappointment and need to study the map of how to keep going. She laid her hands open on the wood, palms up, as if to show me they were empty of anything but truth. I am so ashamed, she whispered. I chose him over you. I told her shame belonged to him, not to her. I told her he targeted the best parts of her and tried to rename them as flaws. I told her the worst thing he had stolen was time, and that time comes back when you stop giving it to the wrong story. She slept in her childhood room that night, and I stood in the hall and listened to her breathe the way I had when she was a baby, counting the small rise and fall like beads. In the morning, we would call Patricia and Agent Luwu. In the morning, we would begin the paperwork that turns truth into outcomes. In the morning, we would make eggs and eat them at the counter, and look at the ocean, and let the day be only a day. But in the quiet before dawn, I allowed myself one thought as simple and bright as a shell in the sand. The wedding band he had placed on her finger would not be his wire anymore. The wire would be the truth they recorded, wrapped around him, tightening, an unbroken circle that he could not slip. News moves through a town like a weather front, and by Monday morning it had arrived with a headline that felt both distant and personal. Local man arrested in multi-state financial fraud scheme. They did not use Madison's name. They did not use mine. They did not need to. His mugshot stared back from the screen with the charm vacuumed out, leaving the gray outline of a man who had traded truth for performance until performance failed him. I set the phone down as if it were hot. Madison came over with a paper bag of takeout and the careful way people walk when their bodies have remembered how to be heavy after too long pretending to float. She told me the charges: conspiracy, money laundering, fraud across multiple states. The bail number sounded unreal. A sum that belonged in a headline about a corporation. Not a single man who liked to wear a suit that implied untouchability. He was considered a flight risk, she said, because men with offshore accounts treat distance as if it were an apology. His accounts had been frozen. It was an ordinary sentence wrapped around an extraordinary change in the air. We ate in the shape of a ritual, cartons lined up between us, chopsticks tapping gently against the rims while steam curled and disappeared. When she set hers down, there was a shadow of the old way she used to prepare to say something hard in a calm voice. How long did you know? She asked. I told her the exact truth. I suspected from the beginning, but I did not have proof until 3 months ago. That was when I hired the investigator. She nodded slowly, and the nod included 1,000 small acknowledgments. That was when I told you about boundaries, she said. That was when I stopped calling. She asked how I had found the past. I told her about the folder in the back of the drawer and the name that had waited there like a seed under snow. Morrison. I told her about the Miami obituary and the confession that had not stayed dead, about the bank that never forgot, about the way money leaves footprints even when it thinks it is walking on water. She listened with her chin in her hand, and then she covered her face, not to hide, but as if remembering the shape of a different life. I was unkind to you, she said. I excluded you from the joy I was supposed to share. I believed the version of family that required me to erase the woman who taught me what family meant. I told her the truth I had needed someone to tell me years ago. Expert predators do not pick weak people. They pick strong ones who have something they want, and then they work to rename strength as dependency and love as interference. He did not misjudge you, he calculated you. The shame belongs to him. She breathed out, and in the silence after that breath a space opened where a future could stand. The next days were filled with the practical momentum that follows a fall. There were meetings with the estate attorney, who spoke like a woman measuring twice before cutting once, and emails with Agent Lou, who did not raise her voice even when she described the scope of the case spreading like spilled ink. There were statements to sign that translated what had been said in a living room into words that could stand up under lights in a courtroom. There were phone calls from Emma and Sarah, who understood the exact shape of the hours Madison was living. They spoke about fear as if it were an animal they had learned to keep out of the kitchen. They spoke about the relief that is so intense it can make your hands shake. My daughter slept at my house for a while, not because she was afraid the dark had changed, but because she needed to hear the waves again from a place where the sound had never been used against her. We walked the beach in the low light and picked up hagstones and smooth glass, and said the names of things out loud to remind the world that we remembered it. She asked me if I thought she would trust again. I told her trust is not a door that breaks and cannot be repaired. It is a hinge. Hinges can be replaced. Hinges can be oiled. Hinges can hold. The prosecutor's office called with a schedule. There would be an indictment. There would be an arraignment. There would be a series of hearings that would test the endurance of anyone who believes justice should be quick. Patricia explained the civil side like a map unrolling. Recovery, restitution, interest that had accumulated not only in numbers but in the lives interrupted. She explained the likelihood, strong, that the money stolen from Robert's dream would return to his daughter, altered by time but recognizable as something that had always belonged to her. One afternoon, Madison arrived carrying a box of photographs that we had not opened in years. We sat on the floor and did the old archaeology of a family, lifting out images of missing front teeth and sunburned noses and birthday cakes collapsing in the middle. We found a picture of her at 9, standing at the edge of the dune in a white sundress, serious as a witness, already plotting a beach wedding that would be all hers one day. She held the photo and smiled in a way that held both grief and gratitude. One day she said, "Not as a wish, but as a plan made by a woman who now writes her own days." When the first hearing came, I took the morning off from the library and sat in the back so my presence could be a quiet shape at the edge of her vision. He came in a suit that did not quite fit the situation. Without a careful haircut, his face looked older, and without the practiced gleam in his eye, his expression looked unfinished, as if without an audience he could not find his lines. Madison's shoulders were straight. She looked at the judge and not at him, and when it was over she walked past Trevor without turning. Outside the courthouse, the air felt like something had finally been washed. There were delays because there are always delays. There were motions and replies and the defense strategy that tried to translate greed into confusion. The agents worked. The prosecutor assembled lines of meaning from numbers and words, turning emails into intent, transactions into a diagram of theft. Marcus Webb, the man who had been the shadow guide through the offshore maze, was picked up and then offered a deal he took. The day Patricia told us he would testify, Madison went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Good. May his words build the very cage he wanted to help build around other women." The night before Madison gave her first formal statement under oath, we sat on the porch steps and watched the stars appear one at a time like switches being flipped in distant rooms. She practiced aloud the simple sentences that do not wobble when someone tries to shake them. She described the isolation through examples that could be weighed. She described the morning he told her mothers are for childhood and wives are for men who deserve devotion. She said the lines as if she were laying beam after beam for a structure that would not collapse when pressure came. The wind lifted her hair and set it down again. I thought of how many nights I had sat in that same spot while she slept upstairs as a child, listening to the sea and promising myself that I would be enough to keep her safe. I had not always been able to keep the world from her, but I had brought the world to account when it needed a name. Weeks later, somewhere between paperwork and court dates, she asked the question that felt like a sunrise. "Help me plan a real wedding," she said. "Not now, someday. When I meet someone who understands that loving me means loving the woman who made me." Barefoot in the sand, lights strung between dunes that do not care about elegance, only glow. I closed my eyes for a moment to keep them from spilling. "Yes," I said. "We will tie the lights to the posts ourselves, and we will cut cake with the knife my mother used, and there will be salt in the air and no secrets. Before any of that, there would be a trial. Before the lights and the vows, there would be sworn testimony and cross-examinations and the long, spare language of a verdict." The day the summons arrived, I held the paper and felt something like gratitude for the bureaucracy that would carry us from harm toward remedy. It is not glamorous, justice. It is forms and signatures and dates that feel like a field of hurdles. But if you keep going, you cross the line, and a person who took what never belonged to him places his hands where the law tells him and waits to learn how many seasons he will sit behind a fence. On the morning the trial began, I stood at the mirror and pinned my hair the way I had when I wanted to feel most like myself during the years of double shifts and night calls. Madison wore a plain suit that did not ask for compliments, and when she looked at me, we shared a small nod that contained an entire language. We walked through the courthouse doors together, mother and daughter in a straight line, ready to tell the truth in a room designed for it. The courtroom was colder than I expected, a deliberate chill that kept breath visible and tempers even. The ceiling seemed too high, the light too white, the wood too perfect to be touched. It was built to remind everyone that personal stories only matter here when they become facts. Madison sat at the table with the prosecutor, her hands folded, a legal pad in front of her with a single pen laid across it. She did not write a word on it all morning. She kept her eyes ahead, steady, the way she used to keep her balance on a boogie board rushing in on a small wave, knees bent, ready to stand. Jury selection took a day that stretched and stretched. Faces were measured with questions that were not really questions, words chosen to test if a person could listen without dressing the story in their own clothes. The defense wanted people who would confuse charisma with innocence and paperwork with persecution. The prosecution wanted people who understood that money leaves footprints and that a gentle voice can be a mask. By the end of the second afternoon, 12 people and 2 alternates had agreed to sit with the weight of other lives in their laps. When the judge thanked them, it was not just ceremony. He knew how long it would take to carry this. Opening statements were a braid of promises. The defense promised the jury a love story, complicated by misunderstandings, and a groom overwhelmed by financial complexity beyond his training. They promised misinterpretations. They promised that what looked like intent would reveal itself as confusion when held up to the right light. The prosecution promised something plainer. They promised a pattern made visible by time and repetition, a straight line drawn through different years and different women. They promised proof that the accounts William Morrison had seeded with stolen money did not lie quietly in the dark. They promised a recording, made with consent and caution, in which a husband described marriage as a mechanism. The first witnesses offered the scaffolding that holds a case above speculation. The bank analysts, gray suits and calm voices, walked the jury through the quiet churn of money in and out of places with famous beaches and less famous ledgers. They pointed to dates, to transfers just under thresholds designed to trigger questions, to accounts that opened and closed like flowers with the seasons. The jurors watched the screens and nodded as if learning a new language. Numbers became sentences. Arrows became verbs. Agent Jennifer Liu testified with a precise kindness that took every accusation of zeal and laid it gently to rest. She outlined the complaints from Emma and from Sarah, and the points of overlap that would be coincidence only if the world were organized by accidents. She explained how an investigation waits until the right conditions protect both truth and the person carrying it. She described the preparation in Madison's apartment, the wire, the placement of devices that recorded more than words. They recorded the simple fact that a man chose the moment to confess, not because he was coerced, but because he believed he was safe. When the court played the recording, the room altered. The device rendered his voice without theater. Gone was the charming modulation. Present was the ordinary cadence of a man explaining a plan he believed was clever. He spoke about legitimacy, about how marriage turns me into we and turns yours into ours. He spoke about a name on a deed as if it were a detail that could be negotiated over coffee. He spoke about my husband's loss as if it were a chess move in a game he now owned. The defense objected twice, 3 times, but the judge allowed the jury to hear entire passages. In the end, their objections only served to underline what was most damning. The jurors did not look at Trevor while the audio played. They watched Madison, and they watched the way she did not flinch. My daughter testified on the 3rd morning. She walked to the stand and did not look back at me. She took the oath and answered questions with sentences that were short, full, and unadorned. She described love in terms clear enough to stand under cross-examination without sagging. She described the isolation with examples that felt small and therefore real. Calls that went from daily to weekly and then to echoes. Holidays that turned into explanations. Invitations that never arrived. She did not speculate about motives. She described behavior. The jury listened the way people listen when they are being asked to hold a life in their hands and not drop it. The defense tried to make a story out of her ambition, her independence, the distance that success requires. They tried to color Trevor as a man caught in currents stronger than he realized, a son trying to please demanding parents, a groom who made poor choices in a fog of expectation. Madison did not argue. She did not move. She said, "I believed I was building a future. He told me my mother was holding me back. He told me dependence on family destroys marriages. He told me the beach house made him feel watched, and that we needed a place that was truly ours." She let the jurors place those sentences against the evidence already in their minds. She did not tidy it for them. She trusted them to see. Emma testified next, then Sarah. They did not know each other before this, but the shape of their stories fit together the way 2 halves of a shell do. The same compliments and the same concerns, the same sudden insistence on privacy dressed as maturity, The same financial advice that began reasonable and ended with access. The defense sought to slice them apart with differences in family background, with the implication that they had collaborated to paint an identical picture after the fact. But the emails, printed and dated, bridged the distance. The exhibits stood between the women and the insinuations like quiet guardians. On the fifth day, the prosecution called a man the jurors did not expect to see in their story. Marcus Webb entered in a suit that fit badly and a face that had learned the lesson of consequences. He had signed an agreement. He answered questions with the unhappy diligence of a person who understands that honesty is his only currency left. He testified that Trevor came to him years ago to learn how to step through a maze without tripping wires. He testified that Trevor brought names, not random names, but names derived from research that would have embarrassed any ethics class. He testified about the plan to marry into a claim, to wrap illegitimate money in the cloth of community property, to extract it under the pretense of making a life. The defense rose again and again with objections, and the judge allowed what the law allowed. When the jury heard that Trevor had assembled a folder of potential targets, each page holding a woman's life like a specimen with notes about vulnerabilities, a sound went through the room that I cannot name. It was not outrage. It was the sound of recognition when a mask is taken off in public and nobody looks away. By the end of the week, the case had the shape of something that no longer needed propping. It stood under its own architecture. The defense called Trevor's parents, who looked bewildered and broken in the way parents look when they discover that love does not make them immune to the facts of their child's choices. They said he had always been charming, that he had been a boy who loved boats and polished shoes, and that he had a talent for making people feel seen. They said they believed in him. The prosecution did not try to crush them. They allowed the jury to hold sympathy for those who were not on trial. Closing arguments brought the braid to a knot. The defense begged the jury to find reasonable doubt in the fog of modern finance and the satire of a grandparent's sins visited upon a grandson. They asked for mercy for a man who had fallen in over his head. The prosecution asked for a verdict that spoke plainly to the difference between falling and choosing. They pointed to the recording. They pointed to the emails. They pointed to the women, 3 in that room, and more implied in the evidence, who had been isolated not by accident but by design. They reminded the jury that marriage is not a laundering service and love is not a cover for theft. The judge's instructions were patient and exact. The jurors filed out, carrying with them the weight they had been preparing to carry. Madison and I waited in a corridor that smelled like polished wood and old paper. She held my hand, not the way a child does, but the way a woman does when she is done pretending that she can walk through everything alone. Time turned viscous. Footsteps came and went. A bailiff laughed, then remembered where he was and stopped. When the door opened and the jurors filed back in, I felt the air in the room change the way it does before a storm breaks. They sat. They did not look at anyone. The clerk stood. Everyone stood. The judge returned. A single sheet of paper was handed across. The clerk began to read. "Guilty on all counts," the clerk read. And for a heartbeat, the words did not land. They hovered above us like a flock startled from a wire, and then they settled, feather by feather, until the room remembered how to breathe. Madison closed her eyes, not to block the sight of him, but to hold inside herself the single, steady truth that had been fought for across too many nights. The judge thanked the jury with the gravity of a man who knows what it costs strangers to sit inside another person's life and measure it. We filed out into a corridor where the air felt thinner and cleaner at once. That evening we did not celebrate. We sat at the kitchen table beneath the soft lamp and let quiet undo the knots adrenaline had tied. In the days that followed, reporters called and the case rippled outward, a stone thrown into the lake of other people's attention. We said no to microphones. We learned how to give statements that did not turn our lives into a performance. The prosecutor warned us that sentencing would not be a simple room with a single door. There would be arguments about years that sound like abstract numbers until you put birthdays and summers between them. When the day arrived, I pinned my hair again and wore the calm suit that makes my shoulders square. Madison stood in front of the mirror and fastened a pair of small pearl earrings I gave her when she was 23 and took her first real job. She looked like a woman who has walked through fire without borrowing its temper. In court, the judge listened to the defense's last attempt to repurpose choice as confusion and to package greed in the language of upbringing. He listened to the government's accounting of damage, not just in dollars that had been laundered into sunlight, but in years bent and faith betrayed. Then he invited statements. The hush that followed had a curve to it, like the inlet where the tide comes in slow and deliberate. Madison walked to the lectern. She did not look at Trevor. She placed her hands lightly on the edge as if it were a railing on a ship and the floor were water. She spoke without hurry. She described the theft that did not appear on any bank ledger. 2 years of her life spent inside someone else's plan. She described the residue predators leave behind that is harder to clean than ink, the doubt that stains judgment, the suspicion that touches kindness with caution. She did not dramatize. She did not shrink. She said the word mother and it did not break. She said the word marriage and it did not flinch. When she finished, a quiet spread through the room that felt like a promise kept. The judge called Trevor by his full name as if returning him to himself without alias or charm. He pronounced the years, more than a decade, and ordered restitution that would outlast his swagger. He spoke about intent in the plain way that drains it of glamour. He spoke about women who were not weak but targeted, and about the criminal patience it takes to study a person's goodness for leverage. As the marshals moved, Trevor stared straight ahead with the dull look of a man who has finally met a door that does not open for him. The irony of the word sentence clanged in my mind as the courtroom rose, a grammar of consequence written at last. Afterward, outside on the wide courthouse steps, light struck the stone at an angle that turned everything crisp. Emma stood with her chin lifted, her relief complicated by the long tale of what she had lived. Sarah held a small notebook as if writing the facts down might keep them from unspooling in memory. Agent Luwu shook our hands the way a person does who is careful not to claim what belongs to others. She said we would never know how many women did not meet him because of this case, how many mornings would arrive unremarkably because the path had been blocked here. Not all victories come with parades. Some arrive like a locked gate standing where a road used to slip into danger. At home, Madison laid the court papers on the table and then did something I did not expect. She went to the cabinet, lifted down the photo box, and spread our summers across the wood. Here she was at 7, lips blue from cold water she refused to leave. Here she was at 15, pretending indifference while her friends shrieked at a wave. Here she was at 9, standing in that white dress at the edge of the dune, serious, plotting light strings between posts, as if lines of stars could be persuaded to come closer for one night. We looked until the photos became less like evidence for a good life, and more like instructions for how to keep living it. The civil work moved like tide charts, incremental and exact. Patricia built a bridge made of filings and affidavits, and discovered funds that thought they had perfected the art of evasion. Madison signed forms in a hand that grew steadier each week. When the transfer came, numbers moving from there to here with the beep and click that accompanies modern miracles, she did not cry. She exhaled. The money did not feel like a windfall. It felt like a ledger balanced in a room where for years the scale had been tilted and the table wobbled. We drove to the beach house with a grocery bag of simple things. Bread, eggs, strawberries, a bottle of the cheap champagne she insisted on for anything that required fizz. The weather softened as if a hand had been laid on its shoulder. We opened the windows and let the salt redo the air inside. Down on the shore, waves lifted and set themselves down with the patience that keeps coasts honest. We walked where the tide scribbles and erases and scribbles again. She talked about fear as a visitor she can now show to the door. She talked about love not as a net to fall into, but as a field to walk across with another person who brings their own gravity and does not borrow yours. That night, we sat on the steps and strung a line of lights between 2 posts. Not for a wedding yet, but as practice. The bulbs caught the dusk and refused to let it be complete. Madison told me she had started seeing a therapist who specialized in untangling coercion from care. She said the work was granular and slow, and that it hurt in ways that felt productive, like a muscle rebuilding after a cast comes off. She asked if I thought I had failed her by not detecting faster, by not shouting louder. I said the only failure that counted would have been refusing to try. I said I would choose every step again that led us to the truth, even the ones that hurt, because they returned her to herself. In the weeks that followed, the story left the front page and slid into the archive. People stopped turning their heads at the grocery store. The cashier asked about the weather again instead of pausing awkwardly when she saw our name on a credit card. We learned how to talk about other things without pretending the big thing had never happened. We laughed at a video of a dog stealing a slice of pizza off a counter. We argued once about a plant and where it should live in the house. We were ordinary in a way that felt luxurious. One Sunday, while the first truly warm wind of the season pressed the curtains toward the room like an invitation, she said it gently, the way you say the words you want to land right the first time. When, not if. I meet someone who knows that loving me means loving the person who sits beside me now. Will you help me plan it? Barefoot. Fairy lights. Dunes. I told her I had the knife my mother used to cut cake and the white tablecloth my grandmother saved for days that deserved it, and that they were waiting. She nodded, then smiled in a way that reached all the way back to 9 years old and all the way forward to a woman who will not mistake performance for devotion again. Sometimes late, I stand on the porch with a mug and listen to the sea keep its appointments. I think about the beach keys I tucked into that leather portfolio and how opening one door closed another. I think about how a gift can be a blade that cuts a tangle free. I think about sentences the kind a judge reads aloud, and the kind we say to ourselves to make sense of what we have survived. The tide returns and withdraws without drama, and the lights we hung do their small work against the dark. My daughter sleeps down the hall when she visits, breathing the even rhythm of a person who has finished outrunning a storm. The house holds us. The future does not feel like a cliff. It feels like a shore we know by heart. There are stories that end in silence, where the truth is buried and forgotten. And then there are stories like this one, where the truth claws its way out of the shadows and forces everyone to look at it. A mother who was told she no longer mattered, a daughter who believed she had to choose between love and loyalty, and a man who thought manipulation was the same thing as power. In the end, the only thing he could not control was the strength of the women he tried to break. Justice did not arrive in one sweeping gesture. It came in patient steps through courtrooms, through evidence, through the voices of those who refused to stay quiet. Madison reclaimed not just her inheritance, but her dignity, her sense of self, and the bond with her mother that no amount of lies could truly sever. Together they showed that when predators build houses out of deception, it only takes one undeniable truth to bring the whole structure crashing down. But this story is bigger than one family. It is about every person who has been gaslit into doubting their instincts, every daughter told that devotion means silence, every mother pushed to the margins by someone wearing a perfect smile. It is about resilience, about how even in betrayal, the seeds of courage wait for the moment to rise. Madison was deceived, yes, but she was never weak. And when the lies finally unraveled, she stood with the very people Trevor had tried to erase from her life. That is the gift of truth that reunites what deception tries to scatter. If there is a lesson here, it is this. Justice does not just punish the guilty. It restores the broken pieces of those who were targeted. It gives victims back the right to write their own future. And as Carol and Madison watched Trevor's world collapse in the courtroom, they were not just witnessing his downfall. They were witnessing their own rebirth, a return to love, trust, and freedom. Some wedding gifts fade with time. Some sit forgotten in boxes. But the gift of truth lasts forever. It is a reminder that no matter how carefully lies are wrapped, they can always be torn open. If you believe that stories like this must be told, if you believe that truth has the power to heal, and if you want to hear more shocking confessions and hidden betrayals exposed, then subscribe to Silent Lies. Because silence protects the liar, but stories like this prove that when the truth finally speaks, it cannot be stopped.